The Cheers to That podcast, proudly brought to you by drinklab.org. Thanks for listening. Your next favorite cocktail is waiting at drinklab.org.
All right, let's dive right in. And what better place to start than with a cocktail that's, well, it's almost as iconic as they come, wouldn't you say? The old-fashioned.
Absolutely. It's a timeless classic.
It really is. It's the kind of drink that conjures up images, like a dimly lit speakeasy or a sophisticated gathering.
A sense of history in your glass.
Exactly.
Yep.
And today we're going on a deep dive into everything old-fashioned. And for this deep dive, our friends over at Drink Lab have provided a treasure trove of information. I mean, we're talking everything from its fascinating history
to the passionate debates it still sparks today.
Exactly. It's more than just a drink. It's a cultural icon.
It really is. What always fascinates me is how it manages to evolve with the times, It's a chameleon, adapting to trends while staying true to its roots.
It's like that little black dress of the cocktail world, always in style. And speaking of personal style, I was particularly drawn to all the different user comments and opinions that Drink Lab gathered. Seems everyone has their own idea of the perfect old-fashioned.
Oh, absolutely. But to really understand it, we need to step back in time, back to its origins. Imagine the late 1700s. Back then, it was all about the whiskey cocktail.
Simpler times, some might say. But what made this whiskey cocktail so special? What were we working with back then?
Elegance in its purest form. Whiskey, sugar, bitters. 3 simple ingredients. It was all about showcasing the quality of the spirit, not masking it.
So how did we go from this elegant whiskey cocktail to, well, the old-fashioned we know and love today? Was it a straight shot, or were there some detours along the way?
Oh, there were definitely some twists and turns. Think about the 1800s. That's when things in the cocktail scene, well, it was like an explosion of creativity. Bartenders were constantly experimenting, adding liqueurs, dashes of absinthe. They were determined to outdo each other. You had the improved whiskey cocktail, the fancy whiskey cocktail.
Sounds like the cocktail equivalent of a fashion show, everyone trying to outshine the other.
Exactly. But in all that excitement, something interesting happened. People started craving the simplicity of the original. It was a rebellion against all the excess. And that's how the old-fashioned whiskey cocktail was born. Like a statement, a return to the roots.
I love that. Sometimes you just can't beat the original. But just to be clear, we're talking about a specific formula here, right? What defines a true old-fashioned?
Absolutely. It's all about that balance, that 3-part harmony between the spirit, the sugar, and the bitters. Each one plays a crucial role in the final flavor.
A symphony in a glass. Now, let's talk about the star of the show, the spirit. Bourbon seems to be the go-to for most, wouldn't you say?
Oh, without a doubt. Bourbon, with its inherent sweetness and those lovely vanilla and caramel notes from the oak aging, it makes for an incredibly smooth, well-rounded old-fashioned. But, and this is where things get interesting, there's a growing number of rye whiskey enthusiasts who believe it deserves a place at the table, too.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. I've heard whispers about rye's spicy character, but I've always stuck with my trusty bourbon. What is it about rye that has people so passionate, especially when it comes to the old-fashioned?
It's that inherent spiciness that makes rye so intriguing, especially in an old-fashioned. It's not just about a little heat. We're talking peppery notes, a hint of clove maybe, and a drier finish compared to that sweeter profile you get with bourbon.
So it's not just about adding spice for the sake of it. There's a strategy involved here.
Absolutely. It's about balance.
Mm-hmm.
That dryness from the rye cuts through the sugar, you see. Mm-hmm. And then you have those spice notes interacting with the bitters. It creates a much more complex, layered flavor profile.
So you end up with a different kind of complexity than you would with bourbon.
Precisely. Rye adds a certain edge, a lingering warmth that bourbon, while delicious, doesn't quite replicate. Some even argue that, historically speaking, rye might be a more accurate choice for the old-fashioned. It was the go-to spirit back in those early days of cocktail culture.
Wow. So it's a rediscovery of sorts, a return to the roots. But no matter which side you're on, bourbon or rye, it's clear that the old-fashioned has inspired a whole world of variations. I was reading through the Drink Lab article, and I have to admit, the Benton's old-fashioned really caught my eye. What is that all about?
Ah, the Benton's old-fashioned. Now, that's a prime example of how creative you can get with this drink.
I have to admit, the idea of country ham-infused bourbon is a little outside my comfort zone.
I know, right? It sounds a little crazy at first, but the magic is in the combination. Trust me on this.
So what does that unique infusion bring to the table in terms of flavor?
Okay, so you have that rich, smoky flavor from the Benton's ham.
Yeah.
And that, believe it or not, complements the sweetness of the bourbon beautifully.
It does.
It really does. And then a touch of maple syrup comes in. Not too much, just enough to add some roundness. And then, of course, you have the bitters, which bring everything together.
Okay, you're making me want to try this now. It's like a dance between sweet, savory, and smoky all in one glass. But the Benton's Old Fashioned isn't the only variation that caught my eye. What about this brown butter Old Fashioned? That one sounds decadent.
Decadent is the right word. It's proof that sometimes the simplest twists can make all the difference.
So walk me through it. What makes it so special?
Instead of regular bourbon, you start with brown butter-washed bourbon.
Brown butter wash. Now that's a term I haven't heard before.
So you basically melt the butter and let it brown, until it's nutty and delicious.
Yeah.
Then you infuse that rich toasted flavor into the bourbon. It's incredible.
Wow, I can only imagine. It's like taking those classic caramel notes that bourbon is known for and giving them a serious upgrade.
Exactly. And pairing it with brown sugar. It's a stroke of genius.
Why brown sugar specifically?
It just works so well with those brown butter notes. It adds another layer of complexity, a hint of warmth.
So we've gone from smoky and savory to warm and nutty. You're taking me on a journey here. And speaking of journeys, no exploration of the old-fashioned would be complete without a nod to the brandy old-fashioned, a drink steeped in history if there ever was one.
Absolutely. The Wisconsin Old Fashioned, as it's often called, it's a testament to American ingenuity, especially during Prohibition.
Because getting your hands on decent liquor back then was no easy feat.
Exactly. So what did people do? They got creative. That's how the brandy old-fashioned was born. Muddled fruit, a splash of soda, anything to make those less-than-ideal spirits palatable.
A drink born out of necessity that turned into a beloved classic. Amazing. And it's interesting you mentioned muddled fruit because that brings us to a bit of a debate in the cocktail world these days. To muddle or not to muddle, that is the question. It's kind of like asking, is it better to have a fireplace or central heating? Both have their charms.
That's a great way to put it. Muddling fruit, especially oranges and cherries, well, it's definitely a traditional element. It adds a burst of freshness, both in terms of flavor and aroma. And let's not forget the visual appeal.
Yeah, who doesn't love those beautiful colors in the glass?
It's true. And those muddled cherries at the bottom, always a nice little treat at the end. But on the other hand, you have this movement in modern mixology towards, well, a cleaner, more minimalist approach. Many argue that a well-crafted old-fashioned, one made with top-shelf spirits and high-quality bitters, it doesn't need any fruit to hide behind.
So it's about letting those premium ingredients really shine?
Exactly. Appreciate the nuances of the spirits, the complexity of the bitters. But at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong answer. That's the beauty of the old-fashioned, really.
It's all about finding what you like, what tastes good to you.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings us to another exciting aspect of the old-fashioned, the endless possibilities for customization. Our friends at Drink Lab have collected some fantastic tips from experienced bartenders, real cocktail enthusiasts, and some of them, well, they're pretty ingenious.
I was particularly interested in the use of high-proof spirits. Is that becoming a trend these days?
It really is. People are embracing those bolder flavors. High-proof bourbons and ryes, they really hold their own against the sugar and bitters. The result is a much more intense, full-bodied experience.
And Drink Lab readers actually mentioned a few specific brands: Wild Turkey 101, Knob Creek, Buffalo Trace, and of course, Woodford Reserve. Can't go wrong with a classic.
Fantastic choices. And if you're feeling really adventurous, you could even try a cask-strength spirit. Bottled straight from the barrel, no filtering, no cutting. It's an intense experience.
Now that's what I call stepping up your cocktail game. And speaking of stepping things up smoked cocktails, I've heard whispers, but is that something you can actually do with an old-fashioned?
Absolutely. You can smoke the glass, use smoked bitters. It adds a whole other layer of flavor. Imagine subtle hints of applewood smoke or mesquite, maybe even rosemary. It's a real sensory experience.
So it's not just about adding a smoky flavor, it's about the specific wood, the unique aroma it brings to the party.
You got it. Applewood, for instance, adds a touch of sweetness. Mesquite brings that earthy flavor, and rosemary, a hint of herbal complexity.
It's like composing a symphony of flavors. And speaking of flavors, we can't forget about the bitters. There's a whole world of options out there beyond Angostura, right?
Oh, absolutely. Orange, chocolate, walnut, celery, you name it, there's probably a bitters for it.
Yeah.
Experimenting with different bitters, well, that's one of the best ways to really personalize your old-fashioned.
It's like having a blank canvas and a whole palette of flavors to work with. And, you know, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of the old-fashioned, I have to say I've gained a whole new appreciation for this drink.
It really is a timeless classic.
Mm-hmm.
It can be familiar, yet still full of surprises. Simple in theory, but infinitely complex in practice.
So for our listeners out there, next time you're thinking about making an old-fashioned, remember, don't be afraid to get creative. Try a different spirit, experiment with new bitters, even dust off that muddler if you're feeling adventurous. Who knows? You might just discover your new go-to, your own signature twist on this amazing cocktail.
Check the description or head to drinklab.org for all the recipes. Cheers!